It's very easy to do different, and I think that many designers believe that different is good, and for us different isn't good enough. It doesn't really cut the mustard, because different is sort of easy. Different is a sort of a vaguely lazy way of thinking that you are doing something interesting. And the intellectual rigor comes from trying to do something which is different and better, and so which solves a particular problem in a more interesting and intuitive way. And it's always seemed to me that just being different for the sake of different is a kind of subconscious desire to be noticed and to have to gain attention, and that doesn't really have a resonance for us. We are furniture designers, and we have a studio in Fulham which we have kept deliberately small, because I feel that it's more interesting and more productive to just have a small team of people. And so I have 2, sometimes 3 assistants, and we feel that that works best. And the truth is, every day I get up in the morning and I'm enthused about a whole range of different types of forms and aesthetics, and so every day is different. But I think the linking factor to all of these things is that really we are concerned with trying to do something better, and certainly better than what has gone before. The prospect of merely repeating the concepts which have already been initiated and have already been completed doesn't really motivate. So the thought of finding new solutions to traditional problems is a very interesting motivation for us. I think that there is a logic to our design process, and when we sit down to do a project, it is very important to know what the questions are that you need to ask yourself, that you're trying to address. They say that, I say that 70–80% of the design process is actually about answering the right questions. And once you know what those questions are, then that guides the natural focus of your intellectual experimentation with where you're going with a particular design. That guides that quite effectively. The other hat that I wear as a designer is indeed this idea of imbuing design with emotion. We have a view, and I have a feeling that furniture really is what makes architecture human. And by that I mean that it is the ability of furniture to influence how a person feels, how a person behaves, and how a person interacts with their environment. And that relationship is, I think, critical to a designer's responsibility to try and improve upon what has gone before. And it is our job to explore that relationship and to understand how we want people to feel and how we want people to behave when they're using our furniture. So the questions that we would ask ourselves are, do we want someone to feel more relaxed? Do we want them to feel more alert? Do we want them to feel more private? Do we want them to feel more sociable? All of these are emotions that one is able to facilitate and encourage, and to a certain amount control, when designing a piece of furniture. And if you understand where you want people to end up at, how you want people to ultimately use that piece of furniture and in what way, then I think that's a fundamental part of the brief which we set ourselves, in a sense, subconsciously. Goalposts change, and the way that we work has changed. When we started out as a design studio, we initiated more projects then than we do now. Now we are lucky enough to be asked and normally be given a brief. And as they say sometimes, there is nothing quite as freeing as a restrictive brief. And by that I mean that somebody has thought about quite carefully before they come to us about actually what they want. I mean, you know, one of the most daunting tasks one can have is just for someone to say, you know, can we have a chair? But I think if someone says to me, you know, can I have a chair that is going to that someone is going to feel good in when they're having a dinner, for example, then that is something which I find quite motivating. And because you know, there's a little bit of creative input into that whole process of what we're trying to design. We work for brands. So we work for brands around the world, and we are asked to design collections for them, and that can be for a whole series of different markets. So we happen to have a very strong reputation for designing outdoor furniture, but we also do a lot of contract stroke office furniture, and then we do a lot of furniture which actually crosses the boundaries between domestic and contract furniture. So we have quite a broad spectrum of design experience and the type of clients that we work for. So on average we would probably hope to, I mean, a project it takes a long time, this whole process. So from receiving a brief to actually having a chair which is being sold can take 2 or 3 years, depending upon the complexity of the project. And so at any one time we maybe have, you know, are working on 6, 7, 8 projects at the same time, and those may involve indeed a whole range of items of furniture within each collection. So we do find that we have a very broad selection of items going through the studio at any one time. The relationship between the studio as a brand and the manufacturer as a brand is an interesting one. And a brand will work with a number of designers, a manufacturing brand will work with a number of designers, all of whom will be gently working towards the shared objective and the shared overall brand experience of that particular manufacturer. And as a design company, at the same time, we have our own signature to a certain extent, and so it's a bit like a marriage to a certain degree, in that certain designers will be more suited to certain manufacturers, and vice versa. And often the best work comes from a design company that understands implicitly what a manufacturer believes is the essence of their brand. So there is a natural fit between what we believe in and what we try and do as a studio with what they believe in and what they try and do. Of course, the interesting situation comes when a brand is quite young and in its nascence, that as a studio, I think what we're quite good at doing, and again is the designer's responsibility, is to help develop and edit how that brand starts to emerge and how that brand starts to build a reputation for a particular aesthetic. And so we've done that with a number of manufacturers. And so, for example, with a company like Oasic, who is a newly established outdoor furniture brand, we have helped, I think, identify and expand and build upon a particular approach to the type of product that we have designed for them, which in turn has helped develop their sense of brand itself. Oasis was a brand that had an overall feeling that it wanted to reference mid-century design, but at the same time give that an unmistakable contemporary twist. And that is a very useful overall approach to the way that they want to see themselves. But within that broad definition of their aesthetic, there was a lot of movement. And so our job was as much as to design a marvellous chair, but it was as much also to think about how that particular design fitted into and built upon their overall approach. I think we can change our style to a certain extent, but people sort of know what they're getting. Is that people know we have a reputation, and we have to a certain extent a signature, and the best companies will understand that this is sort of the territory that they're going to be operating in. Our skill is not about trying to impose our signature upon that brand. Our skill is about trying to ensure that our particular approach is relevant for that brand. And the best relationships between a studio and a brand and a manufacturing brand emerge when actually those two things are totally in line. I think you also referred to this idea about, the studio being a brand in itself. We sort of are. I mean, I think, any humble designer is a brand. It's a question of the balance of the strength of that brand, I imagine, versus the strength of the manufacturer. And that's always an interesting relationship. Certain brands are happy to recognize that an item has been designed by the Gabbertas studio, and that will be credited in marketing and advertising material as being XYZ chair by Gabbertas studio for Boss design, for the sake of argument. I'm not a big fan of the concept of trend. It's something which I react against because it personally reminds me of and is reminiscent of the concept of transience, the idea of the next new collection, and the idea that it might remotely be possible to throw away your furniture because the new collection has come out and actually you want something new. And to me that is anathema, and is something that we've always reacted against. That is not to say that there are obviously not movements and a groundswell of opinion which generally affect and determine how designers design, how consumers consume, and how manufacturers think. And those general approaches are far more fundamental and important than merely being a trend. So, for example, the concept of the workplace becoming increasingly domesticated, or the concept of the kitchen being increasingly the most important room in a house, or the concept of sustainability within design. These are all, I wouldn't regard as being trends, but these are all much more fundamental shifts in the subconscious of the way that designers work. I started my career in furniture design quite late in life. I was interested to a certain extent in design when I was at school, but I chose not to go to art college and went to university instead. And I did a normal job what I call a normal job, until I got somewhat disillusioned with that when I was about 30, and at which stage I felt that I needed to pursue a less meretricious career, and I trained as a cabinet maker. And all of this was about the idea of trying to, I think, subconsciously create some form of physical legacy. I've been in a creative environment historically in advertising, and actually everything that I produced was contained within a single, in those days, VHS cassette. That was my life. That's what I had created. And so when I trained to be a cabinet maker, which is when I was about 30, it was an interesting process because it required the most extraordinary shift in my values as a person, what I regarded as being important, and how I felt I wanted to live my life. And it just happened to coincide that after I had done my apprenticeship as a cabinet maker, and I was actually quite a good maker, and I enjoyed it, the concept of precision and detail really appealed to me, is that coincided with the renaissance of the British designer maker that was going on in the UK at the time, whereby I think it kind of coincided with an awakening in the UK, and this is a UK thing, but I think it's sort of different, I think, to the rest of Europe, whereby people suddenly were waking up to the idea of the value of design versus the idea of style. And it hadn't been so long that people were still buying pretty bad reproduction Georgian furniture to decorate their houses because they didn't know anything any better. And more importantly, they didn't have the confidence or the knowledge to be able to make an informed choice. So in the 90s in the UK, there was this explosion of design and making. So there was this concept of the individual designing and making, essentially for private clients, but sometimes for larger projects as things grew. And this resulted in an explosion of different styles and approaches and material use during that decade, which sort of helped people understand the concept of design, in my view. And it's no coincidence that during that period, IKEA started to emerge as being a viable alternative to antique furniture. And we were encouraged to chuck out our chintz, if you remember. This was the way it kind of went. And so in that period, for 10 years, I was what's called a designer maker. So we would design and we would make, and it was a really, really exciting time. It wasn't until I was 40 that we actually kind of stopped making and concentrated on being a design studio. And that was brought about by a fortuitous moment whereby one of the designs that we had done for a chair, actually my first chair, which was for a company called Alamure, who were a progressive but young British manufacturer. It was we designed a wooden chair for a restaurant in London called Atelier, and the restaurant won awards and their furniture got attention, and this chair got put into production. And that for us was the big moment, I suppose, when, without realizing it, I kind of changed career again and became a designer. And so no longer made the furniture, but we concentrated upon working to commission for larger manufacturers and designing collections for them, which they made and licensed and marketed. So during this time, we have seen the most extraordinary changes in furniture design. Britain differed to other European countries because I don't think we had the same history of design as opposed to the process of styling or the process of engineering or the process of innovation as other European countries. I think that Italy and France and to a certain extent Spain, design is in their blood. I don't think design was in the British blood in the same way. So over the last 20 years in the UK, suddenly people have woken up to the whole concept of design. Not just furniture design, but design in the broadest sense of how it affects everybody through every aspect of their life. And so we have witnessed an explosion of companies and designers and brands out there who are doing extraordinary things. I think the concept of mass production is absolutely fine, and I think IKEA has actually done a great service. There is no reason why good design needs to be expensive. I have no problem with that at all, actually. Design should not be exclusive to financially able people. I think mass production is a double-edged sword, and it's interesting from our perspective because I came from essentially a craft tradition. I had the freedom, in a sense, to make whatever I wanted to make. I wasn't restricted by manufacturing systems or tooling requirements or logistical issues or material choice to the same extent. I was more or less able to do whatever I wanted within my personal capability. So I was sort of free in that respect. However, I was also limited by physically what we could do. And there were processes and manufacturing techniques that were never open to us as a group of small designer makers that would have transformed the type of product that we were able to design. So now that we design for mass production, in a sense we are freer, is that we have the opportunity to utilize and take advantage of the ability to make this for 1p. The problem is that in order to make the first pill cost £5 million, the second pill cost 2p. That's the problem. So we are very cognizant of the restrictions which also apply, which is that in order to make things cheaply, that sometimes there are massive investments that have to be made up front in order to achieve a price. So that means that we have to kind of be very aware of the responsibility we have to try and keep those investment costs down at the beginning and to be realistic about what we can ask a manufacturer to invest in. But at the same time recognize the benefits of having that investment because it enables things to be achievable and at a price point that makes them realistic. It's also interesting, I think, that from a mass production point of view, it also achieves a quality that sometimes is not achievable when you're hand-making things. And that's always interested me, that this idea that we have revered the concept of handmade versus the concept of mass production. But the truth is, in lots of ways, mass production produces a better product. The issue comes down to whether you want to have a product that is personable. I mean, there are some products which are ubiquitous, and actually I have no problem with that. But it's true that there is a natural reaction against that I don't think is necessarily just about design. I think it's a general feeling that as we all become much more aware of and part of a greater world institutions, that there is a balancing requirement for us as individuals to feel that we are part of something local and personalized to ourselves. And that balancing of the desire to feel that we belong and we have a stake in something which is ours and which is localized and which is personalized is very much related to people feeling alienated by not having an identity within such a large institution, which necessarily is the way that the world works now. We all talk about the idea of the globalized community and the global village and the idea of information being instantly available to us, such that information and ideas and products are instantly available worldwide. But this is a recognition of, this is a function of technology, but it's also a function of the ability of, and the requirement of mass production to be mass consumed. So all of those things allow for economies of scale and allow for serious and significant general shifts in the way that people perceive design and perceive products that we have to react to as designers, of course. But I think it is true that we all want to have our own little world. We all want to feel that we've made an impression. We want to have a stamp on what we've created. And I think now more than ever, people do express themselves through what they buy and what they purchase and what they wear and what they use and what they cook and how they decorate their houses. These things are an extension of themselves, of course they are. But the point I was trying to make is that I think that this is a parallel movement to a feeling that people need to belong and a search for an identity within a much larger perspective. We talk about the emotion of design. This is dear to our hearts, and the concept of people's relationship with a piece of furniture or a piece of design is an area that fascinates us. And I think that it only takes one to look at how a person is sitting at a dining table in a restaurant, a chair that has arms versus the chair without arms, and how it completely changes the way that they experience that restaurant, and for the better or for the worse. Personally, I'll only go to a restaurant where I can sit in a chair that has arms, because I think it completely changes for the better the experience of relaxing and enjoying and interacting with your friends and enjoying the process of eating. And just that little observation is something that we mirror and extend and take forward into all different ways that you can interact with furniture. And I remember that we did a range of furniture for a company called Alamere again, called Haven. So when we were designing Haven, I was reminded of an interesting observation which I had sort of subconsciously made when I was younger, which was just watching how people very happily communicated over a garden fence and chatted and talked for hours, totally at ease. And a lot of this was just about the idea of being able to put your hand at a certain height and put your elbows there. And it was apparent, I suppose, that this fence was both a psychological and a physical barrier and that therefore made people feel secure and perfectly comfortable in their own space. And so it was ironic, I suppose, that that barrier was also actually the facilitator for this communication. And so we tried to mimic that experience and to recreate that ability with some of the furniture that we designed within the Haven system, whereby people could come up to the back of a sofa and put their hands on it to allow interaction between people who were passing the sofa and those people who were talking or sitting inside. And I think that example is a very good way of trying to demonstrate how we think about how we can affect people's behavior and their emotions via the furniture that we design. From an environmental point of view, we are acutely aware of what we do and our responsibilities. And in many ways, we are right in the front line of trying to encourage people to choose the right materials and use the right materials in furniture design. And there have been enormous advances over the past few years with panel materials and with wood selection and with materials that have got a smaller carbon footprint, etc., etc. And we are cognizant of all of those things. Personally, I believe that the most effective way of being environmentally friendly is to encourage people to buy furniture that lasts. The concept of longevity, the idea that actually you will buy less but buy better, and that you can buy an item of furniture that you will treasure and grow old with, is the most environmentally friendly thing that you can possibly do. And so we do try and design, so that concept of trying to design for longevity is not just about the quality of the construction, but it's also about trying to design with an aesthetic that is going to last, that is not one that is affected by and influenced by fashion. And this, I suppose, comes back to our overall view that trend is not a particularly useful concept in our business, that really, if you can design products which are over and above trend, then actually that is the way to go. We've designed a lot of chairs, and chairs are very close to my heart. And the truth is, you know, if you were vaguely cynical, you would say that there's no such thing as a new idea. And what is challenging about the idea of a chair is that people have done this perfectly well for thousands of years. And so what we as designers are doing now is effectively dancing on a pinhead. We're trying to find a new way of addressing a traditional problem, and at the same time trying to make a difference and do it better. And when you think of it in those terms, you think, well, how many different ways can there be of sitting? And so that challenge is something which makes me particularly fond of this category. A chair design is you have to wear a lot of hats when you design a chair. The ergonomics are critical. And I've sort of taught myself really how this works and what is important, and you have to get those things right. It is a nonsense to design chairs which are uncomfortable. It has to work first and foremost. This is reminiscent of the whole form versus function debate, which personally I don't wish to get into, but it seems to me that it's such an obvious thing that somehow this has got to perform the function if you are producing workable design. The challenge, that is a given. The challenge is somehow then to make that basic function an interesting and progressive piece. And that's our job as a designer. I think from an ergonomics point of view, there are different ways that you sit in different types of situations and in different environments, and we have to understand that, whether you're asking somebody the requirements for this sort of chair in a working situation is totally different to a chair that you're going to sit at in a restaurant versus the chair you're going to sit at to watch television. So yes, all of those things are slightly different, and we have the ability to influence all of those slight changes to the way that a chair performs in that respect. And yes, it's really important to understand how those change. But the chair itself is really an experimentation of how two simple planes, two almost two-dimensional, but both of which have got a little bit of three-dimensional shaping in. But at the same time, we've got a character when combined with other materials that gives this whole chair a vaguely kind of, how do you put it, a sort of a familiarity that comes from, I think, from the combination of the materials with the appearance and the positioning of the legs, that kind of familiarity, but at the same time something which is uniquely contemporary. And that combination is something which I think is very powerful. We've talked about the idea that furniture is what can make architecture human, and I think this is very true, that as an architect and as a furniture designer, our worlds join, but they also separate. And in many ways, what we try to do and what we end up doing, whether we set out consciously to do that or not, is to help define a space, to give it personality, and to make it usable in the way that it needs to be used. And that is something that affects the scale, the typology, the aesthetic, and of the furniture that we design. But then from a slightly broader perspective, it affects how you envisage those items of furniture being arranged, because all of those things add up to what one could call the psychology of space, which is, I find, quite an interesting concept, which is really concerned with how people use a space and how people feel in that space. And furniture, without a doubt, is really important to that whole process. It's not just about the architectural environment, it is actually also about the way that the whole environment makes you feel and how it makes you behave. And a lot of our work as a studio comes down to the objective of trying to create designs that have character through their simplicity. And this is quite an interesting concept, really, because on the one hand, we feel that character on its own is not enough. It's an easy thing to sort of achieve. And on the other hand, simplicity is also not enough because, again, it's, on its own, it doesn't have the personality or the soul that actually we look for. And so my approach is very much about trying to make the essence of the design, its simplicity itself, give character to that design. And that would indeed, if we have a signature, be the way that we always approach a project. So how does that differ from the concept of minimalism? Well, obviously, the concept of minimalism has a resonance for us. The idea of its essentially reductive nature, the idea of taking out extraneous detail, the idea of reducing concepts and products and designs to their bare essence. And so whether it's Philip Glass, whether it's Donald Judd, whether it's Yves Klein, whatever, these artists, these designers all have an appeal to us, and I understand exactly where these people are coming from. I think the difference that we would try to make is that once one has reduced a design and a product to its essence, we then allow that essence to sing. And it is that singing, which is the character. The concept of Zen and the concept of minimalism have many similar themes running through both approaches. And I am not an expert on either the Buddhist process nor the philosophical approach of minimalism. What I do understand and what I do appreciate and what I do recognize of being important is the ability to have a clarity of form and to understand the value of perhaps slightly old-fashioned concepts like elegance and proportion and the correct choice of materials and having an essentially honest approach to the way that you use those materials. One could argue that that is a vaguely philosophical approach, but those things actually I regard as being intrinsic to the way that we work and entirely natural. I don't think of it as being a philosophy as such. I must admit that I am slightly cynical about a lot of so-called designers who are amazingly trained in various processes of computer-aided design and in rendering skills, who are able to produce beautiful-looking pictures but actually have no real understanding of how they are to be made and the processes involved. And I suppose this sort of comes down to my background as a maker, historically, whereby actually I would be required to look at a pretty picture and then figure out how it was going to be made. And I think you have to have that understanding of the relationship between the process and the design, and the two cannot really be separated. Italy has been at the forefront of design for centuries, and that is partly due to the incredibly close connection between the craftsman and the designer, between the craftsman and the architect. And that relationship has been an entirely symbiotic one that when broken, fundamentally affects the quality of what emerges. And so I'm personally a very big believer in designers having an understanding of techniques and process and actually being able to make themselves. But not to an extent whereby it becomes a limiting factor on how they design. I mean, I think that the imagination has got to be able to run wild, and that's important. But I think that at some stage you need to pull back and understand that at some stage this has got to be achievable. So the process of design also involves a quite significant understanding of engineering and mechanics and process, and to a large extent we've taught ourselves how things get made and what will work and what a particular material will achieve and what a particular process is capable of. So yes, you turn every chair upside down when you're younger, you turn every table upside down when you're younger and understand how these things are made. But the process of self-exploration and self-teaching is something which you never stop, to be honest. But I would always prefer that to be grounded in a good understanding of some basic skills as a maker. We are not engineers, but we need to understand basic engineering principles. And there's also an aspect of engineering which is to do with the very particular way that you design a chair, for example, that is entirely reflective of the ergonomic need to provide support and flexibility of movement in certain areas. And you only need to sit in an uncomfortable chair to understand how someone necessarily may have got this wrong. But when you get it, when it is right, it is in fact a work of art. So yes, a whole process of understanding the ergonomic requirements of chair design is absolutely critical. And I would always encourage a lot of exploration and a lot of reading on this to get those particular aspects right. My next step, interesting. It's tricky to know what's going to happen, and I quite like not knowing what's going to happen. But that's what I would say to people, and then actually quite like to know a little bit more detail, to be honest. But the truth is that goalposts have kind of changed, and when we were starting out, I would be enthralled by the prospect of designing my first chair, and then I would be enthralled by the prospect of doing my first exhibition in the UK, and then I would be enthralled by the prospect of doing my first collection. And so all during that process, without necessarily realizing it, one's, I suppose, ambitions were growing. I'm very pleased with what we've achieved, and I think we've done some great work. And it's not often that one can sit back in life and say that that's actually what you have achieved. And we had an exhibition this year, which is the first solo exhibition, really, of the studio, of a body of work that we felt merited exposure of this kind. And so that was actually, yes, that was a proud, defining moment. I think that the idea that we need to continually grow and to develop as a studio is very important, and is something that motivates me. And just the idea of getting better. It's very simple, that. Just the idea of getting better. And I would be the first to admit that we have indeed improved the quality of our work over the last 20 years. It's not, having said that, I was very interested to find the first piece of woodwork which I made when I was 25 years ago now. Two little chests of drawers, and which I'd made for a friend of mine who actually died, and he left them to me in his will. And I received these things just the other day, and two beautifully made little walnut cabinets, and the drawers still worked amazingly, and the wood was still in its perfect position, and they actually looked as though they could have been made yesterday. And I thought, actually, you know what? I was quite proud of that moment. That perhaps, I shouldn't underestimate what we had achieved initially. But I think now we continue to kind of explore different product categories and different typologies, and I would love to design a range of cutlery. I would love to design a kitchen system. I would love to design a tap. All of these things sound very prosaic, but actually these are rather interesting.